It was one of those cold November mornings in Woodbury, Minnesota. The streets of this quiet suburban town were alive with the familiar rhythms of daily life. Commuters bundled up against the chill, the coffee shops filled with early risers, office buildings lighting up as employees settled into another routine workday. Inside her home, 38-year-old Sharon Bloom walked through her usual morning routine. She wasn't the type to hurry. She was deliberate, thoughtful, someone who prided herself on staying organized. She kissed her live-in boyfriend, David Kofod, goodbye and headed out the door to another day at 3M, the huge manufacturing company where she had carved out a sound career. Nothing in that morning hinted that it would be her last. At 7:30 a.m., Sharon arrived at her office, as she always did. Her car was innocently situated in the employee lot, as it would have been on any other day. She had meetings to attend, tasks to complete, and a life to return to at the end of the day. But as the evening hours rolled in, that return never came. David Kofod began to worry when Sharon didn't make it home for dinner. It wasn't like her to be late without calling. At first, he told himself there had to be a simple explanation. Maybe she got caught up in work, maybe her phone had died. But when repeated calls to her cubicle went unanswered, worry turned to dread. By nightfall, his gut told him something was terribly wrong. Desperate for answers, Kofod called 3M's night shift workers and asked them for a favor. Could they check the parking lot? Was Sharon's car still there? Hours of agonizing silence passed before the call finally came. Her car was still in the lot, unmoved and untouched. Kofod stayed up all night by the phone, sleepless, hoping for any indication that this was just a big misunderstanding. But no call came. No explanation surfaced. And when the sun rose on Friday morning, one thing was clear. Sharon Bloom was missing. By the time Kofod filed a missing persons report with the Woodbury Police Department, Sharon had been gone nearly 24 hours. Investigators wasted no time. Detective David Hines took up the case. The first place he went to see was the parking lot where Sharon's car was still parked. The car doors were locked without any evidence of forced entry, and there were no signs of a struggle. However, what caught his eye most was the utter impossibility of it all. A woman who drives to work doesn't just disappear without her car. It soon centered on 3M, where Sharon had spent most of her day. Hines and his team sifted through security logs, checked emails, and began to piece together a timeline of her movements. Not for long, something started to raise a red flag. Sharon Bloom had never gone to her desk after lunch. She had come in that morning, attended to her things, and then taken a short break sometime after 11, after which she disappeared off the face of the earth. Detectives immediately started interviewing employees, asking questions of who was the last person to have seen her. As Hines went to cubicle after cubicle, he found concerned co-workers, a poisonous workplace environment. It turned out that Sharon had been the target of relentless harassment. Someone had stolen her office keys several times. Major documents had disappeared from her desk. And in a particularly embarrassing incident, an entire pot of coffee had been poured on her chair. It wasn't just the usual office pranks, it was personal. Hines learned that Sharon had been deeply troubled by the harassment. She had confided in Kofod, coming home in tears at times, and even asking herself, "What could I have done to make someone hate me this much?" The detectives found themselves wondering the same question now. And one name shot straight to the top of their list of suspects: Stefan Zanter. Stefan Zanter wasn't just any colleague. He had a past with Sharon, and it wasn't a good one. The two had been rivals for a promotion. Sharon had gotten it. Zanter hadn't. And according to people who knew them, he hadn't taken defeat graciously. Asked for an alibi, Zanter was unusually quick to provide one. A little too fast. He claimed that he had left work not long after 11 a.m., had lunch at a fast food place, then did not come back because his car broke down. A pretty plausible story. But something didn't sit right. Zanter insisted that, after his car had broken down, he just went home. However, the more detectives questioned him for specifics, the more disturbing his answers became. He hadn't seen anyone he knew. There were no witnesses who could vouch for his alibi. No receipts, no surveillance footage. Nothing. It was an alibi made of air. And the deeper detectives dug into him, the more uncomfortable they became. Colleagues portrayed Xanter as hot-headed, a man who held grudges. Some even said he had been responsible for the harassment against Sharon. Investigators had every reason in the world to accuse him. However, belief alone was not adequate. They had to prove that he was culpable. Weeks into the investigation, Day 8 brought along the break. A phone call. A body had been discovered. Sponge. The call came from Rice County, a rural area about an hour south of Woodbury. A local farmer had been out in his cornfield when he came upon something that didn't belong a body. Detectives rushed to the scene, their worst fears all but confirmed before they even arrived. Sharon Bloom had been found. Her clothed body was cast out in the open and left completely intact. There was no evidence of any struggle, no effort to bury her or cover her from view. It was almost as if she had been set there, awaiting discovery. But most striking was the condition of her clothes. Her bra had been pushed upwards, while her pants and underwear were missing. To the seasoned investigator, this was a clear indication of rape. Although in great detail and chilling, detectives knew their real work was only just beginning. Every inch of the scene was examined, every possible piece of evidence was collected. Hair fibers, crucially, had been found. Some were from Sharon, others did not belong to her. A forensic team also collected biological samples from her body in hopes they would lead to a DNA match. If Sharon had fought back, if her attacker had left even the tiniest trace, science might be able to prove who did this to her. As investigators worked the crime scene, another team was dispatched to Stefan Xanter's home. If he was guilty, he was about to find out the noose was tightening. Xanter answered the door as if nothing was different. But when detectives delivered the news that Sharon Bloom's body had been found, his reaction was immediate and extreme. His body went slack and he started to sob. Harsh gasps of air cut through the otherwise silent air, and shallow breathing racked his body. His whole demeanor had changed in that second, like the world had crashed down upon him. Was this grief or guilt? The detectives had seen that kind of thing before. Too much? Too theatrical? That wasn't the reaction of someone who'd been told his workmate was dead. It was the reaction of a man that had just been caught. He rocked on the floor, gasping between sobs for several minutes. At one point, he crawled onto his hands and knees and circled the room in apparent distress. It was weird, it was unsettling, and it wasn't enough to arrest him. Despite their suspicions, detectives still had no physical evidence linking Xanter to the murder. They had an odd alibi. They had a motive. Hay had an unstable reaction, but they didn't have proof. Then the investigation suffered a devastating setback. Forensic testing on the biological samples collected from Sharon's body came back with a shocking result. What had originally been believed to be semen was actually pre-menstrual discharge. It wasn't the killer's DNA. It was nothing. Without a semen sample, detectives had lost their best chance at proving sexual assault, and their best hope of definitively tying Xanter to the crime. What they did have, however, were 2 strands of hair found at the body dump site. The hairs were analyzed and determined to be similar to Xanter's, but that wasn't enough. It wasn't concrete forensic evidence, and it wasn't quite the smoking gun either. And literally having nothing else to go off of, this investigation hit a wall. This case that once burned with urgency would slowly grow cold. Years would pass, and the case would fade away from the headlines. Sharon's family and loved ones were left with nothing but questions and frustration. But sometimes secrets just aren't able to stay buried. By 1989, the whispers seemed to be emanating from Xanter's own household. His wife, Barbara Xanter, had begun to speak. Not to the police, to friends. And one such friend was one Joe Sorensen. Sorensen worked with Barbara at Woodland Elementary School, And at one point on an otherwise wholly unremarkable meeting, Barbara mentioned something which was deeply and profoundly disturbing. She wanted to know if anybody had any idea how to remove blood from a brand new carpet. The comment came out of nowhere. It wasn't related to the conversation, and it wasn't just a small stain. Barbara described a trail of blood running through the house, across the carpet, up the stairs, and into the bathroom on the second floor. And she used a word that sent a chill through Sorensen: splattered. When Sorensen learned about Sharon Bloom's murder and the suspicion surrounding Stefan Zanter, the conversation came rushing back. Had Barbara inadvertently said something about the crime? Detectives had to find out. They asked Sorensen and all of Barbara's other friends if they would wear wires and tape their conversations with her. They agreed. The tapes confirmed it all. Barbara continued to speak about the blood, never knowing she was continuing to build a case against her husband. With this new evidence, detectives obtained a search warrant for the Zanter home. What they found changed the case forever. On March 4, 1992, investigators descended upon Stefan Zanter's home, armed with a search warrant. They had one goal in mind: to find physical evidence linking him to Sharon Bloom's murder. The house was like any other in the quiet Minnesota neighborhood. A well-maintained facade, a neatly trimmed lawn. But inside, detectives believed, lay the key to solving a brutal crime. One team went to the second floor, where Barbara said the blood trailed upwards to the bathroom. The other went to the basement in search of anything that would show Sharon's things that shouldn't have been there. Upstairs, forensic specialists began spraying luminol, a chemical that reveals traces of blood even if a killer tried to clean it up. A trail of blood was highlighted in the blue glow of the reaction. It traced a course from the carpet, up the stairs, and into the bathroom, just as Barbara had described. Someone had bled heavily inside this house. Then, another discovery in the basement gave the investigative team a chill. Not just any keys, Sharon Bloom's keys. Stashed in a tiny storage closet, tucked underneath a bunch of other stuff, was the evidence of Sharon Bloom having been inside that house. Standing there in the basement that day was Detective Ray DiPrima, a grizzled investigator from the Minnesota Bureau of Criminal Apprehension, and he knew it in his guts. "This was it," he said later. "We had him." It was closed, or so they thought. A grand jury indicted Stefan Zanter for murder in October 1992, and investigators felt they had enough evidence to take into court: the blood trail, the keys, and his failed alibi. But Stefan Zanter and his defense team didn't go down without a fight. They filed a motion to suppress several key elements of evidence, claiming that the investigators had exceeded their legal authority in obtaining it. The first argument concerned the set of keys found in the basement. The defense held that the warrant authorized police to collect only blood evidence, not personal items. In taking Sharon's keys, the prosecution had violated Zanter's rights. The case went all the way to the Minnesota Supreme Court. In a shocking decision, it ruled in Zanter's favor. The keys, perhaps the strongest piece of evidence tying him to the crime, were tossed. Without the keys, prosecutors were left with only the blood trail found inside the house, and at the time, DNA testing was still in its infancy. Forensic experts could say only that the blood was consistent with Sharon's, not that it was hers. Faced with a weakened case, Rice County prosecutors made a painful decision. They dropped the charges. Stefan Zanter walked free. It was a crushing blow for Sharon Bloom's family and loved ones. 3 years waiting for justice, and then watch it slip away. For David Kofod, the man who had loved her, it was almost too much to bear. He now knew the name of her suspected killer, but there was nothing he could do about it. By the late 1990s, forensic science was undergoing a revolution. New strides in DNA testing were breathing new life into cold cases. One such breakthrough, called short tandem repeat STR DNA testing, let scientists retrieve genetic material from minuscule, degraded samples. Detective Ray DiPrima had never stopped thinking about Sharon's case, and now he really started to wonder, could the blood evidence from Xanter's house finally be tested? In March 1999, he submitted a sample of the carpet, and the same carpet that had shown positive for blood years earlier, to a modern crime lab. Weeks later, the results came back. The blood wasn't just consistent with Sharon Bloom's, it was hers. There was no longer any doubt. Sharon Bloom had been inside Xanter's house, and she had bled therein. And that wasn't all. Detectives also submitted hair fibers, the ones found near Sharon's body at the cornfield, for mitochondrial DNA testing. This time, the results were indisputable. The hair matched Stefan Xanter. With 2 pieces of rock-solid forensic evidence, cops had what they needed. This time, no legal loophole was available. Xanter was arrested again. Irrefutable proof finally cracked Stefan Xanter. In April 2003, nearly 18 years since Sharon Bloom was murdered, he confessed. He admitted to killing her. He admitted to disposing of her body. And in return for his confession, he agreed to a plea deal. Xanter was sentenced to 25 years in prison, serving his time behind the walls of Minnesota's Stillwater Penitentiary. For Sharon Bloom's loved ones, there was some justice, but no true closure. David Kofod had waited nearly 2 decades for the man responsible for Sharon's murder to be held accountable. He would never get her back. But finally, the truth was out, and the story of Sharon Bloom would be remembered for life. For nearly 2 decades, the case of Sharon Bloom's murder had been an open wound, a case that had come achingly close to justice, yet managed to slip away on a technicality. The man everyone suspected had walked free, shielded by legal loopholes and outdated forensic science. But by then, science had moved along. Time had not erased the truth. Time had preserved it within the tiniest details. A bloodstain in the fibers of a carpet, a strand of hair forgotten in a cornfield. And when that moment came, there was no running away from it. Stefan Xanter may have thought he got away with murder, but yet the past often catches up. After all, it was not just the investigators who refused to give up, but science, the evidence which spoke louder than any excuse, any alibi, or any lie. Sharon Bloom once asked, "What could I have done to make someone hate me this much?" The answer: nothing. She was just a woman working hard and succeeding where others failed. She never deserved such torment, harassment, and violence. And she surely never deserved to be forgotten. The wheels of justice turned painfully slow, but in their own time, they had turned. And as Stefan Xanter stood before his sentence behind steel bars, the world was finally able to say what should have been said years before, that Sharon Bloom's story was not one that ended in silence. She was heard, she was seen, and justice, although slow, was finally served. The body of the woman was in the dirt, unmoving, naked, her back riddled with bullets. In that less noisy and dark corner of a city park, the telltale sign of 8 gunshot wounds piercing her body. The air in that early morning was thick with silence, punctuated by wind rustling through the trees once in a while. It was definitely one heinous crime. It was showing cruelty, utter disregard for life. Detective Paul Villalpando got the call in the early morning hours. A woman, murdered execution style. No identification, no immediate leads. The scene was grim. As he approached, his trained eyes took in every detail: the body, the surrounding dirt, the scattered items nearby. Discarded clothing, empty beer bottles, used condoms, signs of a struggle, or just remnants of the usual nighttime activity in this desolate stretch of the park. It was too early to tell, but one thing was for sure: this wasn't a random shooting. Somebody had brought this woman here. Somebody had wanted her dead. It was here that the first telling evidence struck their eyes as the crime scene technicians began their painstaking work. 2 sets of footprints distinctively imprinted in the dirt near the body. 2 people had stood here. 2 people had walked away. The prints were photographed and carefully documented, potential evidence that could one day break the case wide open. As the forensic team gathered what they could, Villalpando turned his attention to identifying the victim. With no purse, no wallet, and no identification, he was left with only one option: asking around. Taking a photograph of the woman's face, he headed toward the small crowd that had gathered near the edge of the crime scene, drawn in by the flashing police lights. Someone here might know her. One woman, when she stepped forward, had scrunched a puzzled look on her face. Her eyes narrowly examined the photo. Then it flickered something in her eyes. "I think that's Pam," she whispered. "She's always around Hollywood Terrace and Ocean View Boulevard." Hollywood Terrace and Ocean View Boulevard weren't exactly the safest places in town. A hard part of town with a high crime and drug rate. Besides prostitution, very few trusted their neighbor, and one never knew what dangers were lurking in the shadows. As Villalpando approached the address he had been given, his welcome was instant resistance. A large pit bull chained to the front door, its growl a clear warning to stay back. He wasn't about to take his chances. Instead, he called out toward the house, waiting for someone to answer. A moment later, the door creaked open and a man stepped out. His name was Tyrone Sharp, and he knew exactly who Pamela was. When shown the photograph, Sharp's expression changed. "Yeah, that's her," he said, his voice low, filled with something between grief and resignation. "That's Pamela. Pamela Shelley. She was 32 years old, a prostitute of ill fame, a woman fighting for life, and there were very few kinds in the world to help her survive." According to Sharp, Pamela had been to his house earlier in the night. She left around 2 a.m., he said, walking toward a place they called the playground. The playground was well known in that part of the world, one of those places where deals are made and money changes hands under the cover of darkness. "She said somebody had her money," Sharp recalled. "She was going to get it back. I walked her up to the next block and told her to be careful. She just laughed and kept walking. That was the last time I saw her." News of Pamela's murder devastated Sharp. "She was the sweetest person," he said, shaking his head. "There are a lot of girls working these streets, but she was different. Of all the people they could have taken, why her?" Villalpando wasn't to leave a stone unturned. He knew that Pamela's world was small, and someone must have known something. He hit the streets asking questions of everybody who knew her, other women working with her, men paying to be with her, and passers-by who walk on the same corners she had. But the streets kept silent. No one would talk, and no one saw anything. Weeks soon became months, and the case went cold. Leads dried up. Pamela Shelley's murder became another cold case, another name on a long list of unsolved crimes. Then came a break. The crime lab re-examined evidence collected from the scene. Among the trash that was tossed, one piece stood out, a beer bottle, lying just 5 feet away from Pamela's body. It still had liquid inside, untouched since that night. A close-up look had Rodrigo Viesca, forensic technician, investigate further. "The hope is that whoever put this bottle on the ground, they left their marks with it," he said, applying superglue to the surface, enhancing further the details that were there, then carefully lifting the 2 distinct fingerprints. They get entered into AFIS, Automatic Fingerprint Identification System. Negative. Another dead end. The months passed, and the years started to pile up. In 2003, the DNA from the scene was put into CODIS, the National DNA Database. Again, nothing. Detective Bob Conrad refused to give up on the case, and he tried once more. He resubmitted the fingerprints found on the beer bottle. 30 minutes later, the system pinged. This time, it wasn't one match, but 2. Andre Robinson, Adrian Sutherland. 2 men, both ex-Navy sailors, both living in Chula Vista on the night of the murder, and both from the same small town in North Carolina. Now, detectives had their suspects. First, the investigators were able to track down Sutherland. He was cool during the interrogation, answering only those questions necessary. The minute the detective inferred that he might be involved, his demeanor changed. He became defensive, avoiding eye contact and in a denier mode, claiming ignorance of the crime. That was when investigators tracked down Robinson, still in the Navy, to Norfolk, Virginia. He was cooperative at first, almost helpful. He didn't balk at discussing Sutherland, but when the questions leaned his way, so did his attitude. "I don't know anything about that," he said when questioned about Pamela Shelley's murder. The evidence proved otherwise. Both men agreed to submit DNA samples. When the results came in, they proved just what detectives had suspected all along. Robinson's DNA matched the sample taken from Pamela's body. Sutherland's DNA was inside the condom recovered at the scene. Confronted with the truth, Robinson cracked. He confessed that he and Sutherland had picked up Pamela that night, forced her to perform sex acts, and then, as she turned to leave, he had shot her in the back 8 times. When asked why, he had no answer. "I don't know," he muttered. "It just happened. The trial was in 2006. The evidence was overwhelming. Fingerprints on the beer bottle, DNA proof, and Robinson's own confession. The jury was out, and when they returned, their verdict was swift. Andre Robinson was found guilty of murder and sentenced to life in prison without parole. For Adrian Sutherland, prosecutors knew their case was weaker. Though his DNA tied him to the crime scene, he hadn't pulled the trigger. In the end, he accepted a plea deal, 12 years behind bars. For Pamela Shelley, there would be no second chance. But years later, her story was told. Her murder was not forgotten, and the men who took her life would spend their own behind bars where they belonged. Andre Robinson sat in the interrogation room, hands folded on the table, face unreadable. Across from him, the detectives waited. The silence stretched out, heavy and suffocating, pressing against the walls of the small room. He had been calm to this point, but suddenly, something was different. The pressure was amping up, the weight of the evidence becoming too much to ignore. "You're going to sit here and tell me you don't know anything about this?" one of the detectives asked, his voice even but firm. Robinson released a sharp exhalation and looked around the room as if searching for an escape that wasn't there. Then, in a low tone, he confessed. He and Adrian Sutherland had picked up Pamela that night. She had been out on the streets, soliciting. She had gotten in with them. They drove her to the park. They took what they wanted. And then, when it was over, she started to walk away. That was when Robinson pulled the trigger. He had shot once, again, then again, 8 times into her back. The bullets knocked her onto the dirt, where she fell, never having gotten up to run. "Why?" he asked the detective. For long, Robinson didn't utter anything. Finally, he's just mumbling said, "I don't know. It just happened." But that just wasn't enough. That just wasn't an answer. Pamela Shelley was a daughter, a friend, a person who had hopes and struggles and a life that mattered, and she was gone, left to die in a park as if she meant nothing. The detectives weren't buying the excuse. People don't kill for no reason. Was it anger? A sudden violent outburst? Or did Robinson plan it? When the detectives presented Sutherland with the same evidence, his reaction was far different. He wasn't calm like Robinson. He was defensive, shifting in his seat, denying everything. At first, he refused to admit involvement. Then, as the questions kept coming, his story changed. "I don't remember," he said. "Maybe I was there. Maybe I wasn't." But the DNA said otherwise. Confronted with the forensic evidence, he couldn't explain how his DNA had ended up in the condom found at the scene. He couldn't explain why his fingerprints were on the beer bottle. He couldn't explain why Robinson had confessed. Finally, after hours of questioning, he finally spoke. "It was him," Sutherland said, pointing the finger at Robinson. "He did it. He's the one who shot her. It was the classic move blame the other guy." Of course, Robinson had earlier blamed Sutherland, claiming his confession had been coerced, and he had simply told the detectives what they wanted to hear. Now, it was a battle of stories. Yet the forensic evidence spoke the truth. The semen in Pamela Shelley's body was Robinson's. The DNA on the condom belonged to Sutherland. The fingerprints on the beer bottle belonged to both. No doubt about it. Both had been there. Both had taken part. The detectives had enough. 7 very long years later, the case was finally coming to court. Andre Robinson was charged with murder. No plea deal, no leniency. The evidence against him was too strong. For Adrian Sutherland, the prosecution took a different tack. He hadn't pulled the trigger, but he had been there. He had participated. He had done nothing to stop it. In the end, he was given a choice: fight the charges in court and risk a life sentence, or take a plea deal. Sutherland chose to plead guilty to his role in the crime. He was sentenced to 12 years in prison. But for Robinson, there would be no deal. The trial started back in February 2006, and the prosecutors put together bricks of evidence bit by bit as the complete picture of that night emerged. First, the jury saw pictures from the crime scene. They then heard the calls to 911. They finally listened to testimony from forensic analysts who described how Robinson's DNA had turned up inside Pamela. They saw, too, the beer bottle with its smudge of Robinson's fingerprint next to the empty condom packages. And then there was the confession. Robinson had confessed to it. He had told the detectives what he had done, and although he later tried to take it all back, the damage was done. The jury deliberated. The verdict came swiftly. Guilty. Andre Robinson was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He'd never walk free again. Of course, there was no victory in this for Pamela Shelley. She was gone, and nothing would bring her back. Justice, however, was served. Those men who had taken her life had been brought to justice, and finally, after so many years, her case was closed. To so many, she was just a number, just another face on the street, just another unsolved murder that would fade back into the unsolved annals. But to them, she was more than that. Tyrone Sharp could still remember her laugh, the way she walked, the way she tried to find joy in a world that had given her so little. "She was the sweetest person you ever met," he had said. "She didn't deserve what happened to her. Nobody deserves to die that way." Finally, the case of Pamela turned out to be a reminder that no life is insignificant. Every victim deserves justice. Every crime deserves to be solved. And no matter how much time passes, no matter how cold a case may seem, the truth is always waiting to be found. And sometimes justice finds its way home even after years of silence. The life of Pamela Shelley was never perfect. The streets were never kind to her, but she didn't deserve to be left in the dirt, cast aside like garbage, her life stolen out of an act of pure meanness. Justice has been served. After 7 long years, her killers were found, tried, and sentenced. Andre Robinson would never know freedom again, and Adrian Sutherland would spend upwards of a decade behind bars for their part in her death. But justice is not closure. And for Pamela's friends, those who knew her beyond their labels of prostitute and user, a pain lingered. It had kept fresh the memories for Tyrone Sharp of the last time he saw her on the street, smiling and walking in her bouncy walk, getting what was hers. He never thought that was the last time. She was the queen, he had said, and they took her. The case of Pamela Shelley was yet another reminder that so many stories are never told, so many lives lost to the hands of violence, and so many slip through the cracks due to circumstance. Yet every life is important, and every victim has a right to justice. This case was solved, but so many remain waiting for closure. Thousands of cold cases dot the landscape across the country, cases just like Pamela's, of victims who have been silenced, and their stories left unfinished. Yet there is always hope. Advances in forensic science, new techniques in investigation, and the persistence of law enforcement mean that no case is ever really closed. If you know something about any case, any crime, or any missing person, don't stay silent. Speak up. Even the tiniest detail may be the key to solve a mystery, to give closure to a grieving family that's been on their knees waiting. Justice never expires. And as long as there are voices willing to tell their stories, victims like Pamela Shelley will never be forgotten. If you have any information about a crime that remains unsolved, Contact your local law enforcement agency or submit a tip to Crime Stoppers. Someone is still waiting for justice out there.